England, a kingdom carved by conquest, shaped by blood, bound by crown. The year is 1066. A Norman duke crosses the channel with an army, a claim to the throne, and an ambition that would set in motion centuries of power struggles, betrayals, and dynastic dreams. From the thunder of hooves at Hastings to the collapse of royal authority in the anarchy, this is not merely the story of four kings. It is the birth of a monarchy that would come to define a nation. William the Conqueror, a man of iron will, seized England by force and ruled it with a mailed fist, laying down castles like chess pieces and reshaping the land beneath his feet. His sons, William the Red and Henry I, inherited not only a kingdom, but a burden of holding it together through law, through reform, through ruthless ambition. And then came Stephen, a king crowned in haste, whose reign plunged England into chaos, war, and a bitter crisis of succession. But this is not just a chronicle of kings and queens. It's a story of legacy. Under Norman rule, England saw the emergence of ideas that would echo through time. The foundations of centralized justice, the first stirrings of national identity, and a crown that demanded more than just conquest. It demanded continuity. Over the course of less than 100 years, for monarchs would rise and fall. Their battles weren't just fought with swords, but with scrolls, treaties, and oaths. Their victories were measured not only in lands gained or castles held, but in the systems they left behind, the very architecture of power that would later shape Magna Carta, Parliament, and the British constitutional tradition. So, why should you care about what happened nearly 1,000 years ago? Because everything that followed, Tudor pageantry, Victorian Empire, even modern constitutional debates, rests upon the decisions made in this single seismic chapter of English history. From Hastings to Wallingford, from the Doomsday Book to the White Ship disaster, this is where the monarchy as we know it began. These aren't just names from dusty textbooks. William, Henry, and Stephen were men who fought and failed, who ruled and broke, and whose choices still ripple through time. So, settle in, because what you're about to hear is not a simple history lesson. It's a story of ambition, betrayal, resilience, and legacy. And once you've heard it, you'll never look at the English crown the same way again. Welcome to my channel. If you love dramatic tales from real history, battles, betrayals, and the making of kings, you're in the right place. In this video, we're diving deep into the entire history of the English monarchy from 1066 to 1154. We'll explore the rise of the Normans, the forging of royal authority, and the chaos of a kingdom torn apart by civil war. So hit that like button, subscribe for more epic history content, and let's begin the story where it all started, on the blood-soaked field of Hastings. In the early days of January in the year 1066, the old order of Anglo-Saxon England came to a quiet end with the death of King Edward the Confessor. For over 2 decades, Edward had ruled with a mixture of piety and detachment, leaving much of the administrative burden to powerful earls and church leaders. His long, childless reign had nurtured speculation and rivalry over who would succeed him. As Edward lay dying, his court was divided, unsure whether he had promised the English crown to Harold Godwin's son, the powerful Earl of Wessex and brother-in-law to the king, or to William, Duke of Normandy, his distant cousin, and a formidable lord across the Channel. What followed was not merely a succession dispute, but one of the most transformative events in English history, the Norman Conquest. Edward the Confessor's death triggered a crisis of legitimacy. Harold Godwin's son was hastily crowned at Westminster Abbey, reportedly on the very day of Edward's burial. According to Norman chroniclers, Edward had once promised the throne to William of Normandy, and Harold himself had sworn a sacred oath to support William's claim during a shipwreck-induced stay in Normandy some years prior. Whether the oath was freely given or coerced is uncertain, but to the Normans, its breach made Harold a perjurer and usurper. Harold's coronation was met with outrage by William, who saw it not only as a personal betrayal, but as an affront to the divine order. The Pope's endorsement of William's cause further strengthened his sense of righteousness and gave religious justification to what was, at its heart, a political conquest. In Normandy, William began his preparations. He was no stranger to warfare. Having survived the precarious inheritance of the duchy as a child, he had fought rebellions, subdued barons, and turned Normandy into one of the most disciplined and powerful territories in France. Now he turned that military machine toward England. A fleet was built, men-at-arms recruited from across northern France, and a carefully orchestrated campaign launched to gain allies and support from the papacy. This was no mere raid. It was a full-scale invasion blessed by Rome and backed by the promise of land and riches in England. The Norman army crossed the English Channel in late September, landing unopposed at Pevensey. Harold, meanwhile, faced threats on two fronts. In the north, Harald Hardrada of Norway, allied with Harold's estranged brother Tostig, invaded with a large Scandinavian force. Harold Godwin's son marched his army north and decisively defeated the invaders at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, killing both Tostig and Hardrada. But this victory came at a cost. His army, weary and bloodied, had to rush south upon learning of William's landing. In a matter of days, Harold covered a staggering distance from Yorkshire to Sussex, assembling what forces he could to meet the Norman threat. The decisive encounter came on the 14th of October in the year 1066, near the town of Hastings. Harold took position atop Senlac Hill, with a shield wall formed of infantry, confident in the traditional English style of warfare. William's forces were more varied, including archers, infantry, and cavalry, most of whom were well-trained veterans of continental warfare. The battle raged from morning until dusk. At key moments, William's use of feigned retreats drew English soldiers out of formation, weakening the shield wall. The exact details of Harold's death are shrouded in legend. Some accounts say he was struck by an arrow to the eye. Others describe him being cut down by Norman knights. Whatever the truth, by nightfall Harold was dead, and the English line had broken. William had achieved an extraordinary victory, but he did not yet control England. William's path to the throne was not entirely smooth. Though the South and Southeast submitted quickly, the North and Midlands were less compliant. Upon marching to London, William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day in the year 1066 in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony, intended as a moment of solemn triumph, descended briefly into confusion when Norman guards outside the abbey mistook the joyous shouts within as signs of revolt and set nearby buildings on fire. Though he had the crown, William still had to conquer the country. In the years that followed, William faced repeated uprisings. The Anglo-Saxon elite, though weakened, still retained influence, especially in the north and the Welsh borderlands. In the north, Danish fleets allied with English rebels, and in response William unleashed a brutal campaign known as the Harry of the North during the winter of 1069 to 1070. Villages were torched, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and entire populations left to starve. The devastation was so severe that some regions remained wasteland for decades, as recorded in later surveys. This was more than military suppression. It was psychological warfare aimed at breaking the spirit of resistance. To secure his rule, William embarked on a vast redistribution of land. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was replaced almost entirely by Norman lords. By the end of William's reign, around 90% of the land was in Norman hands. Castles sprang up across the landscape, symbols of conquest and tools of control. These stone and timber fortresses, often built with the labor of the subjugated population, became the epicenters of Norman authority. The most iconic of these was the Tower of London, initially constructed as a demonstration of power at the heart of the old city. William's control extended into the administration of the kingdom. To understand and tax his new realm more effectively, he ordered the compilation of an unprecedented survey in the year 1086, the Doomsday Book. This colossal record cataloged landholders, resources, livestock, mills, and peasants, offering a near-complete picture of feudal England. The Doomsday Book was not only a financial and legal tool, but a statement of conquest. Every entry was a reminder of who now owned England. But the Norman Conquest was not simply a political event. It was also a cultural revolution. The old English aristocracy vanished almost overnight, replaced by French-speaking Norman lords. The language of the court, of law, and of high culture shifted from Old English to Norman French. Architecture, fashion, literature, and even food began to bear the imprint of continental influence. The English church, too, underwent profound change. Many Anglo-Saxon bishops were deposed and replaced with Norman clergy loyal to William and the papacy. monastic reform flourished, and Romanesque architecture began to dominate ecclesiastical building projects. Despite these sweeping changes, William took care not to dismantle the entire English system. Elements of Anglo-Saxon governance, such as the shire courts and the royal writ, were retained and adapted. This pragmatic blending of Norman innovation with English tradition allowed for a more stable transition and, ultimately, the birth of a uniquely Anglo-Norman state. By the year 1070, William I had completed the consolidation of his conquest, but not without leaving a trail of blood, fire, and disinheritance. His reign marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. He was not merely a foreign king who took the English throne by force. He reshaped what it meant to be English. A new aristocracy, a new language of power, a new connection to continental politics. All were born from his ambition, yet beneath the layers of Norman authority, older English customs endured, ready to reassert themselves in the centuries to come. The impact of William's rule would be felt for generations. His sons would inherit a kingdom built on both innovation and repression. The Norman Conquest was not a moment but a process. And though the battle had been won at Hastings, the transformation of England continued to unfold long after the smoke had cleared. William I, known to history as William the Conqueror, remains a singular figure, a man of steel will and relentless purpose who changed the course of English history not just with the sword but with vision and administration. His conquest ushered in a new era, one marked by the fusion of two cultures, the remaking of a nation and the forging of an enduring monarchy. By the year 1070, William I, once Duke of Normandy and now King of England, stood atop a kingdom not yet fully his. Though crowned and victorious, his conquest was incomplete. The North remained a turbulent and resistant territory. It had not submitted easily to either Saxon or Dane in the past, and was not inclined to accept a Norman conqueror now. William's first few years as king were marked by revolts, alliances of discontented Anglo-Saxon nobles with foreign invaders, and growing threats to the fragile legitimacy of his rule. The most severe of these uprisings occurred in the north. This region had long held a strong sense of independence, culturally and politically more Scandinavian than Southern English. When resistance flared in Northumbria, William initially responded with a combination of negotiation and garrisoning. But when his appointed Norman earl was murdered and the rebellion spread, his patience ended. William marched north in the winter of 1069 to 1070, launching one of the most brutal campaigns in English history. This scorched earth assault, later known as the Harrying of the North, saw entire villages burned to ash, farmlands razed, and livestock slaughtered. The goal was not merely to punish, but prevent any future rebellion by rendering the region uninhabitable. Chroniclers of the time described widespread starvation and mass death, with corpses littering the roads and entire communities vanishing from the land. In Yorkshire alone, vast tracts of once fertile land became wasteland, a fact grimly confirmed years later in the Doomsday Book. Some historians estimate that over 100,000 people perished as a result of the harrying. It was, by every measure, a genocidal policy and one that has lingered in historical memory as the darkest stain on William's reign. Yet from his perspective, it worked. The North, shattered and depopulated, ceased to pose a meaningful threat to Norman authority. With open rebellion crushed, William began to institutionalize Norman dominance. The system he brought with him from Normandy was feudal, hierarchical, and militarized. Land was granted in exchange for military service, creating a new nobility entirely beholden to the king. William replaced nearly every member of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with Norman or French-speaking lords. By the end of his reign, only a handful of English landowners remained. The confiscated lands were redistributed to loyal followers, many of whom had fought beside him at Hastings. This reshaped the very fabric of English society. Power was now concentrated in the hands of fewer, foreign magnates, all of whom owed their positions to the king. Feudalism was not only a means of military control, but also a system of taxation, governance, and social order. Manors became the units of economic life, with peasants bound to land, owing labor and dues to their lord, who in turn owed service to the king. Sheriffs were appointed to administer local justice and collect taxes, And while the old shire system was retained, it was infused with Norman oversight. The fusion of Norman centralization with Anglo-Saxon local structures gave William's administration both reach and flexibility. William also understood the value of visibility. Castles, often modern Balian design, sprang up across the English landscape. These were not merely defensive structures. They were instruments of domination. Situated in strategic locations such as river crossings, market towns, and rebellious regions, castles were constant reminders of Norman power. The psychological impact of these fortifications cannot be overstated. For the peasantry, a towering stone keep rising in the heart of a village signaled that resistance was futile. By the end of William's reign, it is estimated that over 500 castles had been constructed or begun across England. Chief among them was the White Tower in London, begun around the year 1078, which would later become the infamous Tower of London. Perhaps the most astonishing administrative feat of William's reign was the commissioning of the Domesday Book. In the year 1086, William ordered a vast survey of his kingdom's resources. The goal was to assess the value of landholdings for taxation and to record precisely who owned what. Teams of royal commissioners traveled from village to village, asking landowners how much land they possessed, what it was used for, how many plow teams and villagers they had, what livestock was kept, and what the land had been worth in the days of King Edward. This information was then compiled into 2 massive volumes. The resulting work was so comprehensive and definitive that people joked it was as unalterable as the Last Judgment, hence its name, the Domesday Book. The Domesday Book was far more than a tax ledger. It was a symbolic affirmation of Norman supremacy and the bureaucratic reach of the king. Every entry bore witness to the monumental transformation England had undergone. Land once held by ancient Anglo-Saxon families was now firmly in the grip of William's supporters. The work also showcased William's desire for control and precision. He was no mere warrior king, but a methodical ruler with a deep understanding of administration. While William consolidated his power in England, he remained deeply connected to his Duchy of Normandy. This dual identity as both King of England and Duke of Normandy placed him in a unique and often difficult position. In England, he was the absolute sovereign. In Normandy, he was a vassal of the King of France. This created tension with the French crown and sometimes drew William into continental conflicts. In truth, William's focus was often more continental than English. He spent nearly as much time in Normandy as he did in England, governing through regents when abroad and reinforcing loyalty through carefully chosen marriages and ecclesiastical appointments. The church was another pillar of William's realm, though it was one he sought to dominate rather than obey. He respected the spiritual authority of the church, but ensured that it remained subordinate to royal interests. The appointment of bishops and abbots required his approval, and he maintained tight control over ecclesiastical revenues. His relationship with the papacy was complex. Pope Alexander II had supported his invasion of England and granted him a papal banner, blessing his conquest as a holy cause. But William refused to let the papacy interfere in English ecclesiastical affairs. He rejected papal demands for fealty and insisted that all major church decisions in England pass through royal approval. His reform-minded Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc, shared this vision of a disciplined, loyal, and Romanized church that still respected royal prerogatives. Despite his outward authority, William's reign was not free from personal difficulties, especially within his own family. His eldest son, Robert Curthose, was ambitious, impulsive, and often rebellious. The relationship between father and son soured repeatedly. At one point, Robert launched a revolt against his father in Normandy, forcing William into battle against his own heir. Though the rebellion was suppressed, the damage lingered. William's younger sons, William Rufus and Henry, were kept close but were not immune from jealousy and intrigue. William's queen, Matilda of Flanders, often acted as a mediator between the men, but even her influence could not always keep the peace. These tensions would have lasting consequences for the succession. As William aged, he grew heavier and more irascible. In the year 1087, he led a campaign against the French king who had mocked his corpulence. While besieging the town of Mantes, William suffered a fall from his horse that ruptured internal organs. Mortally injured, he was taken to the nearby priory of St. Gervais. There, He lingered for several days, tormented not only by physical pain but by the burden of unfinished business. He tried to make amends, confessing his sins and distributing alms, but the question of succession remained unresolved. On his deathbed, William divided his lands among his sons, a decision that would fracture the Anglo-Norman world for decades. To Robert, he bequeathed the Duchy of Normandy, a reward more traditional than generous. Robert had long claimed it as his birthright. To William Rufus, he gave the Kingdom of England, recognizing perhaps the younger son's loyalty and ambition. To Henry, the youngest, he gave a large sum of money but no land. He instructed Henry to wait patiently, perhaps envisioning a time when the young man might carve out his own realm. William I died on the 9th of September, in the year 1087. His body was brought to Kin for burial, but even in death his reign remained turbulent. A fire broke out during his funeral, and the corpse, swollen and misshapen, had to be forcibly jammed into a too small sarcophagus, bursting with grotesque crack that filled the church with stench. It was a macabre end to a life of stern majesty and iron command. The legacy William left behind was vast and profound. He had conquered a kingdom, reshaped its aristocracy, revolutionized its governance, and bound it permanently to the affairs of France. England was no longer a northern island on the fringe of Europe. It had become the heart of an Anglo-Norman empire, yet the division of his inheritance sowed seeds of discord that would bear bitter fruit. The tension between his sons, the dual allegiance to both England and Normandy, and the discontent of the native English population would all contribute to the conflicts of the coming decades. William was known by many names. In Normandy, he had been William the Bastard, a child born in an unmarried union who defied all odds. In England, he became William the Conqueror, the man who shattered the Anglo-Saxon world. To history, he stands as the first of the Norman kings, a ruler who will transform a nation. He brought with him the sharp edge of a sword and the calculating mind of an administrator. And though he died far from the land he had won, his shadow would linger over England for centuries. When William the Conqueror died in the year 1087, he left behind not one united inheritance, but a divided legacy. Normandy, the duchy of his birth, passed to his eldest son Robert Curthose. England, the kingdom he had seized by conquest and ruled for 2 decades, was left to his third son, William Rufus. To the youngest son, Henry, he left only a chest of silver. In this distribution of lands and power, William the Conqueror planted the seeds of fraternal rivalry and civil unrest. It was a middle son, William Rufus, red-haired, bold, and often irascible, who would now wear the English crown. But his reign, though often dismissed or overshadowed by those of his father and younger brother, was one of complexity, confrontation, and curious transformation. William Rufus's ascension to the throne was far from universally accepted. The Anglo-Norman nobility, many of whom held estates on both sides of the Channel, were uneasy with the idea of 2 separate rulers for England and Normandy. They feared that their loyalties would be torn and their holdings endangered. Many barons, therefore, looked to Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, as the rightful King of England. Though Robert had a reputation for indiscipline and vanity, he was still the elder brother and heir to their father's duchy. A rebellion quickly gathered in the year 1088. A powerful faction of Norman barons, including Odo of Bayeux, the former bishop and half-brother of William the Conqueror, rose in revolt against William Rufus, intending to depose him and bring Robert over from Normandy to claim the English crown. Faced with this threat, William Rufus acted swiftly and with a political acumen that belied his reputation for impulsiveness. He turned to the English people, the very people his father had subdued and marginalized, and appealed directly to them, promising lower taxes and better governance. He secured their support against the rebellious Norman aristocracy. He offered land and gold to loyal men and forged unexpected alliances with native English magnates who had survived the conquest. It was a remarkable moment, as the son of the conqueror found himself relying on the conquered to maintain his throne. The revolt was crushed. The ringleaders were punished, and William Rufus emerged stronger than before. His ability to outmaneuver his enemies and his willingness to play different factions against each other became hallmarks of his rule. He was cunning and pragmatic, less interested in ideals than in the exercise of power. Though often described by chroniclers as arrogant, harsh, and even blasphemous, he was undeniably effective. One of the central figures during the early years of William Rufus's reign was Lanfranc, the Archbishop of Canterbury. A trusted advisor to both William the Conqueror and his son, Lanfranc played a vital role in stabilizing the monarchy after the elder king's death. A shrewd and learned churchman, Lanfranc gave William Rufus the ecclesiastical legitimacy he needed and mediated disputes between crown and church. Their alliance was one of mutual necessity, not affection. William Rufus respected the institutional power of the church, but had little patience for its spiritual pretensions. Lanfranc's death in the year 1089 marked a turning point in William Rufus's reign. Without his calming influence, the king's relationship with the church became increasingly adversarial. William Rufus delayed the appointment of a new Archbishop of Canterbury for years, during which time he seized the revenues of the archbishopric and treated the church's lands as his own. This led to a sharp decline in royal-church relations. When he finally appointed a successor in the year 1093, it was under immense pressure and with political calculation. The chosen man, Anselm Beck, was a renowned theologian and abbot in Normandy. But from the beginning, the relationship between king and archbishop was fraught with tension. Anselm insisted on reform, discipline, and spiritual independence, while William Rufus demanded loyalty, control, and financial tribute. Their quarrels became symbolic of the larger struggle between secular and spiritual authority that would define much of medieval European history. Anselm resisted the king's demand for homage and refused to accept the king's control over church appointments. William Rufus, in turn, accused him of treason and disloyalty. Eventually, Anselm sought papal protection and fled to Rome, leaving the archbishopric effectively vacant and the king again in control of its revenues. The rift between church and crown was deep, and though William Rufus won the immediate battle, the broader war between kings and clerics would continue for generations. Beyond internal politics, William Rufus also sought to expand the boundaries of his kingdom. He launched military campaigns into Wales and Scotland, though with mixed success. In Wales, he faced fierce resistance from native Welsh princes, whose terrain and guerrilla tactics made Norman advancement difficult. Castles were built in the borderlands, marcher fortresses intended to project power and establish footholds, but full conquest eluded him. In Scotland, William faced King Malcolm III, who had married Margaret of Wessex and represented a fusion of Gaelic and Anglo-Saxon traditions. After a series of skirmishes and tense negotiations, William secured Malcolm's homage in the year 1091, but peace was fragile. Malcolm was later killed during another campaign against England, leading to internal strife in Scotland and further complicating Anglo-Scottish relations. William Rufus's foreign policy also extended across the Channel. His brother Robert Curthose had gone on crusade in the year 1096, pawning his duchy to William in exchange for funds. This temporarily placed both England and Normandy under William Rufus's rule, fulfilling the unity their father had never achieved. But William's rule in Normandy was unpopular, marked by heavy taxation and interference in local affairs. He ruled it less as a native duke than as an occupying king, and resistance simmered among the Norman nobility. Despite his political skill, William Rufus's character remains enigmatic. Contemporary chroniclers, many of them churchmen hostile to his anti-clerical policies, painted him in dark colors. He was described as a religious, greedy, and flamboyant. He dressed in luxurious robes, kept a circle of young courtiers, and mocked religious ceremonies. His court was said to be decadent, filled with jesters, flatterers, and opportunists. Yet, such accounts must be read with caution. William was certainly unorthodox in behavior, but he was also deeply shrewd and capable of ruthlessness when required. His apparent cynicism about religion may have been less about personal belief than about asserting royal supremacy over ecclesiastical power. The king's sudden and mysterious death in the New Forest remains one of the great unsolved events in English royal history. On the 2nd of August in the year 1100, William Rufus went hunting in the royal forest of Hampshire. He was accompanied by a small party of nobles, including Walter Tyrrell, a Norman knight. During the hunt, an arrow struck William in the chest, killing him instantly. Tyrrell immediately fled the scene and disappeared across the channel. The circumstances were suspicious, though no formal investigation was conducted. The king's body was abandoned by the nobles, who rushed to secure their own estates. Eventually, peasants discovered the corpse and carried it to Winchester, where it was buried with little ceremony in the cathedral. Whether William's death was an accident, a political assassination, or divine retribution remains debated. Some chroniclers saw it as God's punishment for his sins and impieties. Others suspected foul play, pointing to the immediate actions of his younger brother Henry, who was present in the area and who swiftly rode to London to secure the treasury and claim the throne. Within days, Henry had been crowned king, suggesting that he had either anticipated William's death or was prepared to seize the opportunity. If there was a conspiracy, it was never exposed. The legacy of William Rufus is a difficult one to summarize. He ruled for 13 years, a relatively short reign, but one filled with conflict, consolidation, and complexity. He continued many of his father's policies, but governed with a harsher hand and a sharper tongue. He was a capable administrator, an able warrior, and a shrewd manipulator of men. He preserved the Anglo-Norman realm during a time of internal and external challenge, but his confrontations with the church and his authoritarian tendencies left deep scars. He was not beloved, even in his own time, but neither was he forgotten. Historians continue to debate his reign. Some see in him the first signs of royal absolutism, a king who rejected the traditional constraints of Christian kingship and pursued power for its own sake. Others see a man shaped by insecurity, a younger son who inherited a throne he was not raised to expect, ruling a kingdom still unsteady from conquest. He lacked his father's gravitas and his brother Henry's political finesse, but he held the kingdom together at a crucial moment. In doing so, he ensured that the Norman experiment in England did not collapse into factional chaos. William Rufus, the Red King, remains a figure who resists easy interpretation. He lived in a time of transition, between conquest and consolidation, between the old ways and the new. His sudden, strange death in a forest filled with political animals mirrors the precarious nature of his life and reign. Though overshadowed by the giants on either side of him, his conquering father and his reforming brother, his reign forms an essential bridge in the story of medieval England. He preserved the kingdom, asserted royal authority over baron and bishop alike, and set the stage for what would follow in the reign of Henry I. In the stillness that followed the mysterious death of William Rufus in the New Forest, power passed not to Robert Curthose, the elder brother and Duke of Normandy, but to the youngest son of William the Conqueror, Henry. It was an audacious move. With remarkable speed and determination, Henry rode to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and within days made his way to London, where he secured his coronation. The church, the nobility, and the citizens of London lent their support. His elder brother was still returning from the First Crusade, absent from England, and many among the Anglo-Norman elite distrusted Robert's reputation for indiscipline and extravagance. In that narrow window of opportunity, Henry claimed a throne that by strict lineage was not his, but by political necessity became his. From the outset, Henry I positioned himself as a different kind of king. If William Rufus had ruled by force and fear, Henry sought legitimacy through consent, reform, and the revival of legal traditions. Within days of his coronation, he issued the Charter of Liberties, a solemn declaration of royal promises meant to assure his subjects, especially the powerful barons and churchmen, that his rule will be just and measured. The charter denounced the oppressive practices of his predecessor, pledging to abolish arbitrary fines, respect the rights of the church, and refrain from seizing land or inheritances without due cause. In effect, it was a royal compact. The king promised restraint, and in return he asked for loyalty. Though the charter was not a binding constitution in the modern sense, it set a precedent. It established the notion that the king's power was not absolute, but could be bounded by law and custom. In this way, Henry laid the intellectual and political foundation for what would later become a tradition of English common law. His reign marked a conscious return to the legacy of Edward the Confessor, not just in imagery, but in legal substance, fusing Anglo-Saxon traditions with Norman structure. Henry also made a politically shrewd marital alliance that would define the character of his rule. In the year 1100, he married Matilda of Scotland, a princess of Anglo-Saxon royal blood, descended from Edmund Ironside and raised in a religious household at Romsey Abbey. The union was more than symbolic. By marrying Matilda, Henry bound the Norman ruling house to the ancient royal line of Wessex, healing a division that had lingered since the Norman Conquest. Their marriage produced a legitimate son, William Adelin, and a daughter, also named Matilda, both of whom will become central figures in the future of the English monarchy. Henry's court was known for its culture and learning, earning him the title of the Scholar King. Fluent in Latin and a patron of clerics and administrators, Henry surrounded himself with capable men drawn from both Norman and English backgrounds. But his intellectual interests did not dull his political instincts. He was an exacting and sometimes ruthless ruler who strengthened the monarchy through administrative reform and rigorous control of his officials. One of his most enduring legacies was the reorganization of royal finances. Under Henry, the exchequer emerged as the central institution for managing royal revenues. Coins were regularly reminted to ensure purity, sheriffs were held accountable for tax collection, and the royal domain was more efficiently exploited. The system used a method of accounting known as a pipe roll, which documented royal income and expenditure on a massive parchment roll. This record-keeping not only improved financial stability, but also expanded the reach of the crown into every corner of the realm. But Henry's reforms were not merely fiscal. He imposed strict discipline on the barons, reasserting royal authority over lands and castles. Many had grown powerful during the lax rule of William Rufus, and Henry wasted no time in breaking rebellious lords and confiscating estates. Justice was centralized in the royal courts, reducing the independence of feudal jurisdictions. These changes helped establish the crown as the supreme legal and administrative authority in the land, a legacy that would shape English governance for centuries. Yet not all was harmonious. Henry's relationship with the church was marked by recurring tension, especially with Anselm, the same Archbishop of Canterbury who had clashed with William Rufus. When Anselm returned from exile shortly after Henry's coronation, the two men initially cooperated, but disagreement soon emerged over the controversial issue of investiture, who had the right to appoint bishops and invest them with the symbols of their office. Anselm, loyal to the reforms of the papacy, maintained that only the church could confer spiritual authority. Henry, like his father before him, insisted on the king's right to appoint bishops as royal officers. The standoff lasted for years. Anselm once again went into exile, and letters flew back and forth between England, Rome, and the exiled archbishop. The matter was finally resolved in the year 1007, when a compromise was reached. The king relinquished the symbolic act of investiture, but retained the right to approve episcopal elections and receive feudal homage from the appointees. This solution allowed both sides to save face and set a lasting precedent for the relationship between church and crown in England. While Henry solidified his hold over England, his eyes turned toward Normandy. Robert Curthose, returned from crusade a hero in name, but a poor ruler in practice, had alienated many Norman nobles. Tensions between the brothers erupted into war. In the year 1006, Henry invaded Normandy and confronted Robert's forces at the Battle of Tinchebray. The battle was decisive. Henry's army triumphed, and Robert was captured. Rather than execute his brother, Henry kept him in prison for the rest of his life, moving in between various castles in England and Wales. Normandy, once again, came under control of the English crown, uniting the Anglo-Norman realm in a way their father had never fully achieved. Henry's victory brought both political prestige and practical problems. Administering Normandy required balancing local customs with English governance. Rebellions flared periodically, and Henry spent considerable time on the continent suppressing unrest and defending his rights. But the conquest also strengthened his international reputation. He arranged strategic marriages for his children, allied with key continental houses, and played a pivotal role in the politics of northern France. His domestic peace was shattered, however, by a catastrophe that shook the monarchy to its core. In the year 1020, Henry's only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, set sail from Normandy back to England aboard a grand vessel known as the White Ship. The ship was filled with the young nobility of Henry's court, sons and daughters of the realm's most powerful families. It was said to be a festive voyage, with wine flowing freely and a mood of celebration among the youthful passengers. But as the ship pulled away from Barfla at nightfall, it struck a submerged rock and quickly sank. Nearly everyone aboard drowned. William Adelin, Henry's pride and future, perished in the freezing waters of the English Channel. Chroniclers report that he initially escaped in a small boat, but turned back upon hearing the cries of his half-sister and was swallowed by the sea. The White Ship disaster was more than a personal tragedy. It was a dynastic crisis. With the death of his only legitimate male heir, Henry's succession was thrown into doubt. The court and kingdom reeled from the loss, and many of the great noble families lost sons and heirs in the same disaster. Henry's grief was profound, but he acted with characteristic resolve. He married a second time in hopes of producing another son, but no further legitimate children followed. Determined to preserve his legacy, he turned to his daughter, Matilda, the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor. In a kingdom that had never before contemplated a female monarch, Henry began a campaign to have Matilda accepted as his heir. He required his barons and bishops to swear oaths of allegiance to her. Though many did so, it was clear that this was a fragile solution, one dependent entirely on Henry's ability to enforce his will and maintain stability until Matilda could assume power. Thus, by the year 1020, Henry I stood as both a triumphant and a haunted monarch. He had united England and Normandy, strengthened royal authority, reformed governance, and laid down the early architecture of English law and finance. But the tragic loss of his son cast a shadow over all his achievements. His reign had brought peace, order, and prosperity to a realm that had known rebellion and invasion, but its future was now uncertain. The problem of succession would outlast him, and the oath sworn to Matilda would be tested in blood. Henry's life during these years embodied both the promise and the peril of medieval kingship. He was not a warrior in the mold of his father or brother, but a builder of institutions, a maker of alliances, and a man deeply conscious of legacy. He combined the Norman genius for control with the English reverence for law, and though his reign would not conclude until the year 1035, the period from 1100 to 1020 marked the peak of his power. England, under Henry, was no longer a conquered land. It had become a kingdom of order and ambition, though one whose fate still hung precariously on the survival of a single dynasty. The sinking of the White Ship in the year 1020 cast a long and terrible shadow over the reign of Henry I. In that cold black water off the coast of Barfla had drowned not only his son William Adelin, but also his hopes for a stable succession. Though his reign had brought unity and reform to England and Normandy, it now stood on a fragile foundation. Henry was left without a legitimate male heir, and the realm, though strong in administration, was vulnerable to the instability that inevitably followed an uncertain line of succession. Henry was not the sort of king to surrender to fate. Though devastated by the death of his son, he took immediate steps to secure his legacy. His second marriage to Adeliza Louvain in the year 1021 was entered into a single goal: to produce another male heir. Adeliza was young, beautiful, and noble, but after nearly 15 years of marriage, the union remained childless. With the years advancing and the prospect of another son fading, Henry turned to his one remaining legitimate child, his daughter Matilda. Matilda was not an ordinary woman, nor did she live an ordinary life. Born in the year 1008, she had been raised in royal circles and sent at an early age to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, where she was married to Henry V. As empress, she acquired a taste for power and ceremony and developed a commanding presence that impressed even her enemies. Her husband's death in the year 1027 returned her to her father's court, but she did not come home as a mere widow. She returned as a woman accustomed to rule. Henry began a campaign to have Matilda recognized as his heir. In the year 1027, he made the unprecedented move of requiring his barons and clergy to swear oaths of loyalty to her. This was a revolutionary act. No woman had ever ruled England in her own right, and the very idea of a female sovereign challenged centuries of precedent and deeply held beliefs about authority, warfare, and the nature of kingship itself. Many nobles were reluctant, some outright hostile, but Henry's force of will and control over the machinery of governance left them little choice. The oaths were sworn, if not with enthusiasm, then at least with outward obedience. Matilda's status as heir, however, remained tenuous. Her father recognized that she needed more than noble oaths to secure her place. She needed a strong political alliance. In the year 1028, she was married to Geoffrey of Anjou, the teenage son of Fulk V, Count of Anjou. The marriage was a calculated move to unite the House of Normandy with the powerful and often troublesome region of Anjou, which bordered Normandy to the south. But the union was deeply unpopular with the Norman and English nobility. Anjou was a traditional enemy of Normandy, and Geoffrey, though ambitious and energetic, was viewed as an upstart. The marriage itself was far from harmonious. Matilda, 10 years older than her new husband, reportedly found Geoffrey immature and lacking in imperial polish. The early years of their union were marked by quarrels and separations, but in time they produced children, including a son named Henry, named after his grandfather, who would later change the course of English history. Despite the marriage's rocky beginning, Henry I saw in it the best hope for securing a dynastic future. The union of Normandy, Anjou, and England to the bloodline of Matilda and Geoffrey offered the promise of a powerful, united realm that could stand firm against rivals at home and abroad. Yet none of Henry's efforts could erase the central problem. Many of his nobles did not want to be ruled by a woman. The idea of a queen regnant, ruling in her own right, was deeply alien to the medieval mind. Women were expected to be consorts, not commanders. Though Matilda was of royal blood, highly educated, and imperious in demeanor, her gender made her vulnerable in the eyes of a warrior aristocracy. Her haughty manner, imperial pretensions, and foreign husband did not help her cause. Many barons, especially those who had grown rich and powerful under Henry's reign, feared losing their influence under a new, unfamiliar regime. To secure Matilda's succession, Henry repeatedly summoned his magnates and compelled them to renew their oaths. In the year 1031, a great council at Westminster once again affirmed her as heir. Prominent bishops, earls, and sheriffs placed their hands on relics and swore allegiance. But beneath the surface, discontent simmered. Oaths could be sworn and broken. Loyalties could shift. Henry's own awareness of this fragility haunted the final years of his reign. Henry remained active and alert well into his 60s, dividing his time between England and Normandy. His control over his territories was firm, and his network of sheriffs and justiciars kept order across the realm. Yet the matter of succession remained unresolved in spirit. Even if it was settled on parchment, the king's health began to decline in the year 1035. While in Normandy, he suffered a sudden illness. Some said brought on by gluttony after eating a meal of lampreys, a delicacy he was known to enjoy against his physician's advice. The sickness grew worse over several days, and he finally died on the 1st of December. His body was brought back to England and buried at Reading Abbey, a monastery he had founded years earlier. The death of Henry I was a moment of reckoning. Though he had ruled wisely and firmly for over 3 decades, though he had secured oaths and alliances to ensure a smooth succession, his death brought not stability, but the complete collapse of his carefully laid plans. Matilda was in Anjou at the time, managing affairs with her husband and children. Her absence, combined with lingering resentment and fear among the English barons, created an opening. Into that vacuum stepped Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew and grandson of William the Conqueror through his daughter Adela. Stephen was a popular and affable nobleman, known for his charm and bravery. He had been raised in the English court and was well liked by many barons. Though he had sworn the oath to Matilda like the others, he now seized the opportunity for himself. With astonishing speed and secrecy, Stephen crossed from Boulogne to England and made his way to London. There, he secured the support of the city's merchants and aldermen. He then moved to Winchester, where his younger brother Henry, the Bishop of Winchester and papal legate, handed him the royal treasury. From there, he journeyed to Canterbury and convinced the archbishop to crown him king. Within weeks of Henry I's death, Stephen had been anointed and crowned in defiance of all the oaths made to Matilda. His usurpation was not without controversy, but it gained traction quickly. Many of the barons preferred a male king, even if his claim was legally dubious. Matilda, still abroad and encumbered by her foreignness and imperious manner, was slow to respond. In the early days of Stephen's reign, it seemed as though the succession crisis had been averted. He was recognized by the church, supported by the nobility, and hailed by the people. But the peace was shallow and the loyalties brittle. The years that followed would plunge England into one of the darkest and most chaotic periods in its history, a brutal civil war that would last nearly 2 decades, remembered simply as the Anarchy. For all his competence, vision, and ambition, Henry I had failed in the one task that defined medieval kingship, securing a clear and unchallenged succession. The oaths he compelled from his barons were not enough to bind them. The administration he had so carefully constructed could not enforce his will without a strong hand at the center. The legacy of his reign would be one of both triumph and failure. For in death, his kingdom was left to unravel. When King Henry I died in the final month of the year 1035, the succession should have been clear. By all accounts, the throne had been promised to his only surviving legitimate child, Matilda, and the barons of England had sworn their oaths. But Matilda was an Anjou, far from the court, and she was a woman, a ruler in theory but not yet in possession of power. Into this moment of ambiguity stepped Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew and a grandson of William the Conqueror. Stephen was quick, charismatic, and well-positioned to act. In defiance of his oath to Matilda, he crossed the Channel, made for London, secured the support of key magnates, and claimed the English crown. Stephen's seizure power was stunningly effective. Within weeks, he had secured both Winchester and the treasury, and was crowned king with the backing of the church, thanks in no small part to his brother Henry, the Bishop of Winchester. The move outraged Matilda and shocked many who had seen Stephen swear personal allegiance to her. But the reaction was far from unanimous. A significant number of barons, wary of female sovereign and her unpopular Angevin husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, accepted Stephen. He was seen as a lesser disruption, a man of noble blood, agreeable nature, and military competence. Stephen's early reign, however, quickly fell into disarray. Though he moved swiftly to consolidate power, granting lands and privileges to retain baronial loyalty, his generosity weakened royal authority and emptied the treasury. The kingdom Henry had ruled with discipline, and force began to splinter. Local lords raised private armies, built unauthorized castles, and began exercising near-independent rule within their territories. Stephen, unlike his predecessors, lacked the will or the machinery to curtail them. Matilda, enraged and disinherited, did not remain passive. She and Geoffrey launched intermittent campaigns into Normandy to assert her claim, eventually gaining control of large portions of the duchy. Meanwhile, inside England, unrest brewed. In the year 1038, Matilda's half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, Henry I's illegitimate but favored son, renounced allegiance to Stephen and declared for Matilda. This marked the beginning of full-scale civil war, a brutal, lawless struggle that would devastate England for nearly 2 decades. The chroniclers of the time called it simply the Anarchy. The conflict began in earnest when Robert of Gloucester landed in England and began rallying forces against Stephen. The country became divided, with regions swearing loyalty to Matilda and others standing by Stephen. Castles became centers of resistance and rebellion, and towns were besieged repeatedly. Mercenaries flooded the land, and law broke down. Crops went unharvested. Churches were plundered, and the ordinary people suffered most. A chronicler wrote that Christ and his saints slept, such was the lawlessness and bloodshed. The most dramatic moment of Stephen's reign came at the Battle of Lincoln in the year 1041. Stephen, attempting to lay siege to Lincoln Castle, was caught by surprise when forces loyal to Matilda, led by Robert Gloucester and Ranulph of Chester, launched a sudden assault. The battle was fierce, and Stephen, fighting bravely in the thick of the melee, was eventually overwhelmed and captured. He was taken prisoner and brought to Matilda, who now stood poised to claim the throne. With Stephen in captivity, Matilda entered London to prepare for her coronation. Yet her triumph was short-lived. Though she had the legal right to rule, her demeanor and demands alienated the citizens and many nobles. She insisted on the full royal title of Lady of the English and treated her new court with imperious authority. Her refusal to compromise, to forgive, or to reward her supporters with the same generosity Stephen had shown cost her dearly. The people of London turned on her. As she prepared for her coronation, an uprising forced her to flee the city in haste. Then came the rout of Winchester in the year 1041. Matilda's forces laid siege to the royalist garrison holding Winchester. Stephen's queen, also named Matilda, led a counter-siege with fresh troops, trapping the empress. In the ensuing battle, Robert of Gloucester was captured, and Matilda narrowly escaped. The two factions agreed to a prisoner exchange, Stephen for Robert. With the king free once more, the war resumed in grim earnest, but the tides of fortune continued to shift. For the next several years, England descended further into chaos. No side held a decisive advantage. Stephen ruled in name, but not in reality. Castles dotted the landscape, raised without royal permission, held by warlords who recognized neither king nor empress. Some noblemen even played both sides, switching allegiance as suited their interests. The country was carved into zones of influence, and the king's writ no longer ran beyond the walls of his supporters' strongholds. Throughout this period, Stephen's own position remained precarious. He was a king without control, generous to a fault, unable to discipline his vassals or defend the innocent. He sought papal support and even had his son Eustace crowned in a bid to secure his dynasty. But this alienated the church, who did not approve of hereditary succession without Rome's approval. Matilda, meanwhile, grew weary of the endless struggle and eventually withdrew to Normandy, leaving the battlefield to her young son, Henry. Henry of Anjou, later to be known as Henry II, first entered England as a teenager in the year 1047. Though young, he carried with him the bloodline of both Norman and English kings and the energy of a new generation. His father, Geoffrey of Anjou, had secured Normandy, and now Henry turned his eyes to England. His initial campaigns were limited in scope, but carefully orchestrated. He began to win the support of disillusioned barons who had grown tired of the anarchy and longed for stability. Stephen, though still on the throne, was aging and weary. His son Eustace, the designated heir, was bold but unpopular. A final military campaign launched by Henry in the year 1053 brought both sides to the edge of exhaustion. Neither army was strong enough to defeat the other outright. Then fate intervened. Eustace died suddenly that year. Some said from a broken heart, others from divine judgment. Whatever the cause, his death removed the last great obstacle to a negotiated peace. In the autumn of the same year, King Stephen and Henry met at Wallingford. With the support of key barons and bishops, they reached an agreement that brought an end to nearly 20 years of civil war. The Treaty of Wallingford, signed in the year 1053, recognized Stephen as king for the remainder of his life, but named Henry as his heir. In return, Henry pledged loyalty and promised peace. It was not a triumphant resolution for either side, but it was a necessary compromise for a bleeding, broken realm. Stephen spent the last year of his life in relative peace, finally able to rule without open defiance. But he was a diminished figure. The war had eroded his authority and legacy. He had come to the throne with promise and popularity, but had failed to uphold royal power or protect the people. The very foundations of kingship had been shaken during his reign, and the memory of the anarchy would haunt England for decades. When he died in the late autumn of the year 1054, he was buried beside his wife and son at Faversham Abbey, a church he had founded during the height of the conflict. With Stephen's death, the Norman line effectively came to an end. The throne passed to Henry of Anjou, who would become the first of the Plantagenet kings. The long years of civil war gave way to a new dynasty, one that would usher in renewed strength and centralized authority. But the lesson of Stephen's reign endured, that a kingdom divided at the top would always fracture at its base. Stephen of Blois, remembered by some as well-meaning and brave, by others as weak and ineffective, ruled not in majesty, but in turmoil. His was a broken reign, marked by shattered promises, shifting loyalties, and national suffering. Yet in the end, he helped deliver England back to peace, even if it came not through victory, but by yielding to the rightful heir of the woman he had once denied. The conquest of England by the Normans in the year 1066 began with a single battle, but it reshaped the kingdom for centuries to come. In the near century that followed the arrival of William of Normandy, the land, its laws, its language, and its lords would be transformed beyond recognition. Though only 4 monarchs ruled in this turbulent era, William I, William II, Henry I, and Stephen, Their legacies endure in the very fabric of English political and cultural life. The Norman period was not simply a change in rulers. It was a forging of an identity, both royal and national, that would outlast the men who shaped it. In the earliest days after the conquest, the Normans imposed their will through sword and stone. Castles rose across the countryside, grim reminders of domination and control. But while military power ensured victory, it was culture and administration that secured rule. The Normans brought with them not only knights and feudal customs, but also a new aristocracy, a new courtly language, and a new vision of kingship rooted in continental traditions. The fusion of Anglo-Saxon resilience with Norman ambition produced a hybrid society, one both rigid in its hierarchies and dynamic in its potential. The cultural shift was most visible in architecture. The great cathedrals and castles of the 11th and 12th centuries reflected the monumental Norman style. Thick walls, rounded arches, and soaring stone towers. These were not merely defensive structures. They were expressions of order, permanence, and divine right. From Durham to Canterbury, Norman masons and engineers laid the physical foundation of a realm transformed. The landscape itself was remade, rivers redirected, towns fortified, and churches rebuilt in stone rather than wood. Even village churches bore the marks of Norman influence, ensuring that no subject could escape the shadow of conquest. Language, too, underwent a quiet revolution. French became the tongue of the court, of the nobility, and of legal discourse. Latin remained the language of learning and liturgy, while Old English, spoken by the common folk, began its long transformation into Middle English. For generations, the ruling elite and the ruled spoke different tongues, a linguistic divide that mirrored social divisions. Yet from this separation came eventual synthesis. New words entered the language, words of law, of feasting, of fashion and war. The vocabulary of government, of commerce, and of courtesy was reshaped by Norman French. Over time, this enriched and expanded English tongue would become one of the most expressive in the world. Beneath these cultural shifts lay a revolution in governance. William the Conqueror's rule had established the monarchy as the supreme landholder, with all lords owing fealty to the crown directly. This was a radical departure from the more diffuse obligations of the Anglo-Saxon past. The compilation of the Doomsday Book in the year 1086 was the purest expression of this principle, a detailed inventory of land, wealth, and obligation that gave the king unparalleled oversight of his realm. It was not merely an exercise in taxation. It was a statement of ownership and control. Successive Norman kings built upon these foundations. The exchequer system developed under Henry I allowed for more efficient taxation and centralized royal finances. Royal justices traveled the land, enforcing the king's peace and gradually standardizing legal procedures. The notion that the king's court was the highest in the land began to take root. Though these reforms were often pragmatic in origin, they carried deeper implications. They helped forge the idea that law and authority flowed from a single, visible, and accountable source, the monarch. That principle would evolve, be challenged, and one day be constrained, but began here. The consequences of these developments stretched far beyond the court. As royal authority grew, so too did the mechanisms by which it could be contested. The tension between crown and church, between baron and king, would shape the politics of later centuries. But the idea of the realm as a unified political entity, governed by a central power, took root during the Norman era. Even in times of division, such as during the anarchy under Stephen, the longing for order, for legitimacy, and for rightful succession spoke to an emerging sense of nationhood. At the heart of this evolution was the question of succession itself. The crisis that followed the death of Henry I revealed the fragility of dynastic order, but also the depth of institutional memory. Matilda's claim to the throne, unprecedented though it was, found support not only in law but in the promises made by the king and accepted, if begrudgingly, by the nobility. Though she was ultimately denied the crown, her assertion of rights helped redefine the limits and possibilities of kingship. She was a mother, a warrior, a claimant, and she did not rule, but she never yielded. Her son, Henry of Anjou, inherited more than her blood. He inherited her cause. The Treaty of Wallingford, signed in the year 1053, marked more than the end of civil war. It marked the transfer of power from a Norman house of William the Conqueror to a new dynasty, the Angevins, also known as the Plantagenets. The rise of Henry II ushered in a new chapter of royal ambition, legal reform, and territorial expansion, but it rested squarely upon the foundations laid by his Norman forebears. The institutions he inherited, centralized justice, royal taxation, and baronial vassalage, were Norman in origin, though soon to be transformed by Plantagenet energy. Yet the transition was not only political. The legacy of the Norman kings lived on in ideas. The concept of the king as a figure both above and within the law. The belief in a kingdom as a singular body with the monarch at its head, and the understanding that legitimacy came not only from conquest, but from consent. Even Stephen's broken reign affirmed the need for continuity, for the rule of law, and for the balancing of competing claims. His failure was a cautionary tale that would echo into the future. The end of Norman rule did not mark a rupture, but a progression. The Plantagenets would extend Norman administration, codify legal customs, and challenge papal authority with even greater force. They would wage wars across France, clash with rebellious barons, and leave behind their own towering legacies. But they ruled in the shadow of those who came before, of William who conquered, William who quarreled, Henry who governed, and Stephen who faltered. Even centuries later, the Norman legacy remained visible. The great stone keeps, the orderly shires, the cathedral vaults, the parchment rolls, and the legal traditions all bore the imprint of an age when kings believed themselves the direct inheritors of Rome and heaven alike. The Normans were conquerors, yes, but they became kings, not just of land, but of an evolving political tradition. Their century-long reign gave England its royal vocabulary, its administrative skeleton, and its first taste of the tensions between authority and legitimacy that would define its constitutional path. Though only 4 monarchs held the throne between the year 1066 and the year 1054, their impact was immense. From the battlefield of Hastings to the treaty fields of Wallingford, the Norman kings laid down the stones upon which the edifice of the English monarchy would be built. They were not perfect rulers, nor were they always just, but they were architects of enduring power. The Norman era was not simply about kings, but about the making of England. It was in this period that a conquered land became a governed realm, where the language of court and countryside began to merge, and where the seeds of identity, legal, cultural, and national, first took root. The crown passed from William, to Henry, to Stephen, and then to Henry again, but by then, the monarchy itself had been transformed. Their reign was a crucible for which the English state emerged. Not finished, not whole, but tempered in fire and bound by stone, charter, and sword. And in that legacy, the Norman kings live on,